There are cities that were built to last, and there are cities that were never meant to exist at all. Venice belongs to the second kind. It rises out of the water like a hallucination, a dream made solid, a network of impossible structures that should have sunk long ago. Yet it endures, patient and unreal, floating between sea and sky. The story of Venice is not only a history of a city, but a quiet study of human stubbornness, of how people can insist on living where no one should live, and how that insistence becomes civilization itself. In the beginning, there was only water. The Venetian lagoon, a wide, shallow stretch of salt and silt, lay between the mainland of Italy and the open Adriatic Sea. It was a place of tides, reeds, fish, and silence. The Romans knew it, but they did not build there. It was too unstable, too wet, too uncertain. The ground shifted with the moon. The only inhabitants were birds and fishermen, drifting on small wooden boats, guided by the soft hum of wind. But when the Roman Empire began to collapse under the weight of invasion, refugees fled to the water. They came from the mainland, from Aquileia, Padua, and Altinum, seeking safety from Gothic and Lombard warriors. They found in the lagoon a kind of protection, a barrier of nature itself. Armies could not march through mud, horses could not gallop on water, and so the people built huts upon stilts, anchoring themselves to islands that barely existed. That was the beginning, not of a city, but of an idea, that if the land could not hold them, they would learn to hold the land. The earliest Venetians were not engineers, but survivors. They gathered reeds and clay, drove wooden stakes deep into the mud, and wove the beginnings of foundations where none should stand. Over time, the huts became houses, the houses became churches, and the churches became the outline of a city. The stakes, made of alder and oak, did not rot, for they were buried beneath oxygen-starved silt, turning stone hard over centuries. Venice was not built on rock, but on drowned forests, an entire city resting upon the ghosts of trees. This method, so strange and primitive, became the heart of Venetian engineering. Thousands, then millions of wooden piles were driven into the lagoon. Each one supported the weight of stone buildings above. When a Venetian walked across a square, he was walking not on land, but on the tips of ancient trees anchored into mud. And yet it worked. The city stood. Venice did not grow like other cities. It grew horizontally, like coral, spreading across small islands connected by bridges. Streets became canals, roads became water, boats replaced carriages. The city's geometry was fluid, curved, unpredictable, alive. Every building leaned slightly, every passage turned unexpectedly. Venice was never planned. It evolved like an organism, adapting to its habitat. By the 9th century, Venice was no longer a refuge, but a republic, La Serenissima, the most serene one. It had ships, trade, power, but its foundation remained fragile. Beneath every marble palace lay the trembling question, how long could this miracle last? The Venetians, practical dreamers that they were, understood their city was an illusion that required constant maintenance. They became masters of control, not just of water, but of time itself. The tides were both enemy and ally. If they rose too high, they flooded the city. If they fell too low, the canals became mud. So the Venetians began to design the lagoon itself, dredging, redirecting rivers, building barriers. Every motion of the sea became part of their calculation. To understand the engineering of Venice, one must understand its paradox. It survives not by resisting nature, but by cooperating with it. The city breathes with the tide. The water flows beneath, between, and around it. The walls are not sealed from moisture. They absorb it, release it, endure it. The Venetian engineer learned patience, not dominance. Every brick, every pile, every canal is a negotiation between human desire and natural force. The stones of Venice were brought by boat from distant quarries. The wood came from the forests of Slovenia and Croatia. Everything had to be transported across water. The act of building was an act of faith. No wall could stand unless thousands of invisible wooden columns below were perfectly balanced. The margin of error was thin as a reed. The buildings themselves were designed to be light, not the massive fortresses of other medieval cities, but delicate constructions of brick and limestone. The weight of beauty had to be measured carefully. Too much stone, and the house would sink. Too little, and it would crumble. Architecture in Venice became a kind of floating art, practical poetry. Over the centuries, the engineers learned new tricks. They used layers of Istrian stone, dense and waterproof, to protect lower walls. They developed systems to measure tidal flow. They built wells to store fresh water, since the lagoon was salt. Each well was a small engineering miracle, a hollow lined with clay, filled with sand that filtered rain into purity. Even thirst was solved through design. But the greatest achievement of Venetian engineering was not its survival, but its stability over centuries. Empires rose and fell, earthquakes shook the mainland, and wars ravaged Europe, yet Venice stood. Its foundations, laid in mud and faith, proved stronger than stone. The city's beauty, so famous today, was born out of necessity. The narrow canals were not designed for charm, but for function, to move goods, to connect homes, to carry the living and the dead. The bridges were low and archless because tall ones would block boats. The plazas were small because land was scarce. Every feature that later generations called romantic was in truth practical. The poetry of Venice is the poetry of survival. Venice's engineers understood water as few others did. They learned to predict the lagoon's moods, to read the patterns of wind and tide. They built fondamente, strong embankments that held the city together. They invented bricole, wooden posts planted in the lagoon to mark safe channels for ships. They became map makers of the invisible. The city's structure was an organism, constantly repaired, replaced, and renewed. Old piles were strengthened, foundations rebuilt underwater, walls patched with layers of new stone. Venice was never finished. It was always under maintenance, always alive. And yet the city remained fragile. Floods, called acqua alta, rose without warning. Salt water crept into basements, corroded marble, and ate away at frescoes. Each century brought new threats, the sea rising, the earth sinking. Still, the Venetians refused to abandon their miracle. They believed that as long as they could measure, adapt, and mend, the city would never die. By the Renaissance, Venice had become a floating empire. Its ships ruled the trade routes of the Mediterranean. Its engineers built dry docks, arsenals, and shipyards that astonished visitors. The Venetian arsenal could build a fully armed galley in a single day, a feat of precision that rivaled modern assembly lines. The same logic that kept the city afloat fueled its industry, efficiency, born of necessity. The Republic became wealthy, but it never forgot that wealth was borrowed from the sea. The Doge, the ruler of Venice, performed an annual ceremony called the Marriage of the Sea. He would sail out in a golden boat and throw a ring into the water, declaring, "We wed thee, O sea, in sign of our true and perpetual dominion." It was not just a ritual of pride, but of dependence. Venice could not exist without the sea, and it knew it. The centuries passed, and the city grew heavier. Palaces multiplied, cathedrals rose, bell towers leaned. The engineers fought back with repairs, reinforcements, and endless observation. They knew that Venice was not a city that could rest. It was a city that had to keep adjusting forever. And so it survived, through plagues, invasions, and revolutions. A miracle, yes, but one made not by faith alone, but by mathematics, wood, and patience. Venice, the city that should not exist, became the most enduring illusion in human history, a lesson in how beauty can be engineered from mud, how fragility can become strength, and how the impossible, once built, can outlast the very hands that built it. Venice, from its earliest whispers in the marshes, was not meant to exist. It was not founded upon a mountain or a hill or a plain, but upon indecision itself, upon mud and salt and the trembling meeting place of river and sea. The world beyond the lagoon called it madness, and perhaps it was, for what reasonable civilization seeks safety by sinking wooden poles into mud and building a city that must fight against water every single day of its existence? Yet the Venetians, who were once refugees of the mainland, fleeing waves of Germanic invaders, found in this madness a strange stability. They built not only a city, but a defiance, an experiment that still to this day should not be standing. The engineering of Venice begins with trees, millions of them, not the living trees that stretch their arms toward sunlight, but dead ones, driven into the muck like arrows in the earth. They came from forests far away, from Istria, from Slovenia, from the Dolomites. Workers floated the trunks down rivers, dragged them through canals, and buried them in the lagoon floor. Each one was driven deep into the clay until the oxygen vanished and rot could no longer survive. A strange chemistry of preservation began. The wood, denied air, hardened into a kind of stone. Venice, the floating city, was born on this wooden cemetery. And yet this was only the first illusion. The Venetians never truly floated. Their houses did not bob like boats. Their foundations were rooted, invisible, sunken beneath the shimmer of green water. Above the piles they laid planks, then blocks of Istrian stone, dense, white, and impervious to salt. The weight pressed down, the piles held firm, and generation after generation trusted this invisible forest beneath their feet. No one walking through St. Mark's Square could feel the billions of tons of dead trees supporting them, but they were there, buried in silence, a fossilized army holding up the dream of a city that should have sunk 1,000 years ago. The Venetians were not engineers by trade. They were merchants, sailors, and opportunists. Their brilliance came not from academic design, but from practical desperation. When you live in a place where the tide rises twice a day, you learn quickly what will stand and what will crumble. The buildings were shaped not by grand theory, but by rhythm, the rhythm of tides, the patience of mud, the whisper of decay. Even the streets themselves, the canals, were engineered not by architects, but by time. Water found its easiest path, and the Venetians, wise enough to obey nature rather than defy it, built along those lines. The first bridges were simple planks thrown across narrow canals. Later came arches of brick and stone, elegant and unnecessary in their beauty. Each one defied the logic of its materials, holding curve against gravity, and yet the Venetians trusted their instincts. Their bridges were not only ways to cross water, they were metaphors, between islands, between classes, between centuries. The most famous, the Rialto, stands upon 12,000 wooden piles, driven by men who never saw its final arch completed. It is a structure that should have collapsed long ago, but it remains, because in Venice, even decay learns to pause. What's curious is that Venice was not built all at once. It accreted like coral, an island, a few huts, a chapel, then another island, another bridge, another chapel. The system expanded like a living organism, adjusting itself, healing its own wounds. Each generation learned from the mistakes of the last. Some foundations failed, walls tilted, towers sank, and rather than rebuild elsewhere, they learned to reinforce. The Venetians understood earlier than most civilizations that perfection is an illusion. What endures is adaptation. Water, of course, was both friend and enemy. It brought trade, wealth, and fish, but it also brought salt, corrosion, and time's slow assault. The engineers of Venice learned to use lime mortar, to let buildings breathe, to design walls that could absorb the swelling and shrinking of the tides without cracking. They created drainage patterns invisible to the eye, designed courtyards to collect rather than repel water, and even built steps that anticipated flooding. The rhythm of life in Venice was a rhythm of surrender, not fighting the water, but dancing with it. Yet for all this elegance, the greatest madness was not in the construction, but in the maintenance. A city standing in water requires eternal vigilance. The piles must be checked, the canals dredged, the stones replaced. For 1,000 years, the Venetians have been fighting a war against entropy, a war they cannot win but refuse to lose. Every restoration is an act of faith. Every new generation inherits a sinking city and decides once again to keep it alive. There is something almost religious in that stubbornness, a belief that effort itself can defy gravity. During the Renaissance, when most of Europe was obsessed with conquering new lands, Venice turned inward. Its architects, like Jacopo Sansovino and Andrea Palladio, looked to ancient Rome for inspiration, but applied it to their fragile lagoon. They built libraries and basilicas with columns that reflected on the water like dreams. They designed facades that faced the sea as if in dialogue with the horizon. Each building was a poem written in brick, and each one had to obey the secret engineering laws of the lagoon. The soil beneath Venice could not bear the weight of extravagance, so even beauty had to be calculated. Beneath the art and the architecture lay the true miracle, hydraulics. The Venetians learned to control the tide's breath, to open and close channels, to protect the lagoon from silt and the mainland from floods. Their engineers became quiet magicians, invisible to history's stage. The Republic guarded their knowledge fiercely. The blueprints for the city's water gates were state secrets. To harm the lagoon was treason, for Venice knew what the rest of Europe would one day learn. When you depend on nature, you must respect its temper. And still, time was patient. The Adriatic rose inch by inch. The canals deepened. The wooden piles, though preserved, began to shift. Buildings leaned, walls cracked, mosaics peeled. The modern world looked at Venice not as a model of engineering, but as a miracle of survival. And yet it remains one of the most advanced feats of ancient civil engineering, a living laboratory of human endurance against natural law. As centuries passed, the city continued to sink, not dramatically, not all at once, but like a sigh stretched over centuries. Scientists later discovered that it wasn't only the soft soil or the tides that caused it, but human ambition. Wells were drilled beneath the city to draw fresh water, and with every drop, the land compressed. Venice was not just sinking, it was being drained from within. When the wells were closed, the descent slowed, but the scars remained. The irony was almost poetic. The city that had learned to live with water was undone by its thirst. Even today, engineers measure Venice's pulse in millimeters. Each new flood, each high tide becomes a line in a long conversation between humanity and nature. The Mose project, with its colossal metal gates designed to rise from the sea and block floods, is merely the latest verse in that dialogue. It may save the city for another century, or it may fail. But what matters is not the outcome, it is the persistence. Venice teaches us that engineering is not only about strength, but about humility. You do not conquer water, you coexist with it. And so, as the bells of St. Mark's echo across the lagoon, as tourists drift through canals unaware of the ancient stakes below, the true story continues, the story of mud, timber, and time, and the madness of people who refused to let their city die. The crazy engineering of Venice is not in its methods, but in its belief. The belief that something so fragile could be eternal. Beneath the silent canals of Venice lies a labyrinth no tourist ever sees. The visible city floats on reflection, marble facade shimmering, gondolas slicing ripples through green water. But below all that beauty, there is an invisible machine, ancient, fragile, and still breathing. The story of Venice is not above the surface, but under it, where wooden piles sleep in the dark, and water moves according to rules set down 1,000 years ago. To understand Venice, one must descend into the mud, the silence, and the slow pulse of a living city built upon the impossible. Every Venetian building, no matter how grand or humble, depends on the same principle: trust in what cannot be seen. Beneath the foundations lie forests of submerged timber, not a few dozen, but thousands upon thousands of poles driven into the lagoon floor. Each pole supports the weight of stone and brick above it, transferring the burden to the compacted clay below. The remarkable truth is that these poles, buried for over 1,000 centuries, have not rotted. Deprived of oxygen, preserved in the mineral-rich water, they have petrified, turning as hard as marble. They are, in essence, the fossilized skeleton of the city. The Venetians never drew grand blueprints for this system. Their engineering evolved through repetition, one building teaching the next, each success passed down as instinct. The process was both art and endurance. Workers balanced on floating platforms, hammering poles into shifting mud. Each strike was an act of faith, guided not by measurements but by sound. A dull thud meant depth, a hollow one meant weakness. In the long echo of their labor, a city began to grow, pile by pile, echo by echo. Above the piles came the plinths, thick layers of oak and Istrian limestone, chosen not for beauty but for survival. Istrian stone was the secret weapon of Venice, a dense, almost waterproof rock quarried from across the Adriatic. Unlike marble, it resisted salt. Unlike granite, it could breathe. Laid in courses over the timber foundations, it distributed the load evenly, creating a stable platform for walls and arches. Even today, divers exploring beneath Venetian palazzi find these stones perfectly intact, while the timber beneath them hums quietly in the dark. What few realize is that Venice was not only built to resist water, but to cooperate with it. The city's foundations were designed to absorb movement, not prevent it. Every building in Venice shifts slightly with the tides, rising and sinking a few millimeters each day. The mortar between the bricks is soft, intentionally so, allowing expansion and contraction. The pavements in the squares are slightly concave, not flat, so rainwater flows inward to ancient drains instead of out to the streets. The entire city functions like an organism that breathes with the sea. In the medieval centuries, this invisible system worked so perfectly that no one questioned it. But as the population grew, so did the problems. Waste from homes poured directly into the canals. Silt filled the channels, and the once clear lagoon began to choke. The Venetian engineers, men whose names have mostly been forgotten, devised subtle but brilliant solutions. They redirected rivers entering the lagoon, building barriers of stone and reed to slow sediment flow. They mapped the tides, creating primitive charts that predicted floods. By the 14th century, Venice had already developed the world's first environmental regulations, laws forbidding the dumping of debris into the lagoon and punishing those who blocked the flow of water. In a sense, Venice invented ecological engineering long before the term existed. The Renaissance brought not only beauty, but a new obsession with precision. Scholars began studying the lagoon's hydrodynamics as if it were a living being. Leonardo da Vinci himself, who visited Venice in the early 1500s, marveled at its hydraulic logic. He sketched sluice gates and flood controls, imagining ways to strengthen the delicate balance between salt water and fresh. Though many of his ideas remain drawings, they captured the city's eternal anxiety, the fear that one wrong move could undo everything. Venice, in his mind, was a machine built from humility. By the 17th century, the weight of history itself began to press down. Palaces grew heavier, towers leaned, the foundations groaned beneath centuries of prosperity. The great campanile of St. Mark's, the city's proud bell tower, became a symbol of this tension, a structure that seemed eternal, yet was doomed to fail. In 1902, after nearly a millennium of service, the campanile finally collapsed. The cause was not storm or earthquake, but exhaustion. The timber piles below had shifted, the bricks had loosened, and gravity had quietly claimed its debt. When it fell, the Venetians did not mourn for long. They rebuilt it, stone by stone, as it was, where it was. The new campanile rose upon new foundations, stronger, deeper, but still resting on the old faith that the lagoon would hold. Beneath all this, the hidden arteries of Venice continued to flow. The city's drainage system, a maze of tunnels, culverts, and submerged channels, is one of the least understood achievements of ancient engineering. Each building, each courtyard, each alley contributes to an invisible network that flushes the city twice a day with the tide. The incoming water lifts, cleanses, and withdraws, carrying silt and waste out to sea. It is an imperfect system, messy and unpredictable, but remarkably resilient. Modern engineers, when studying Venice, often admit that they could not design it better. But time, as always, introduced new problems. Industrialization brought dredging, ship traffic, and pollution. The delicate equilibrium of the lagoon began to falter. Saltwater intrusion corroded foundations. Heavy ships displaced the tidal flow, eroding banks and exposing piles that had rested untouched for centuries. For the first time in history, the very act of human progress threatened to undo the miracle it had created. Venice became a paradox, a symbol of engineering genius, and a victim of its own existence. The 20th century marked a turning point. Engineers from across the world arrived to study how Venice survived, hoping to learn from its endurance. They found a city both ancient and alive, where medieval technology coexisted with modern sensors and steel reinforcements. Divers filmed the underwater forest of piles, covered in algae but still firm. Geologists mapped the slow subsidence of the lagoon bed. Hydrologists measured the salinity of canals, discovering that the water's chemistry itself was a guardian. The high mineral content prevented bacterial decay, preserving the wooden foundations like fossils in amber. And yet, for all its secrets, Venice was drowning. Each year the floods grew higher, the foundations weaker. The phenomenon of acqua alta, high water, became both spectacle and warning. Tourists waded through St. Mark's Square on raised walkways, unaware that beneath them lay a city gasping for air. Scientists debated solutions, and in 2003, Italy launched its most ambitious project since the Renaissance, the Moses System. Named after Moses, who parted the sea, it aimed to do the same, to hold back the Adriatic itself.
The Moses barriers are massive steel gates anchored to the seabed at the lagoon's inlets. When tides rise dangerously, compressed air forces the gates upward, creating a temporary wall against the sea. It is modernity's answer to medieval faith, engineering replacing prayer. But Moses is also fragile, dependent on perfect timing, maintenance, and politics. Its creators claim it will save Venice for another century. Its critics say it merely delays the inevitable. Either way, it stands as the latest chapter in the same ancient story, humanity negotiating with nature, never defeating it. In truth, the engineering of Venice has always been less about invention and more about patience. The city teaches endurance, not dominance. It accepts failure as part of its rhythm. When walls crack, they are mended. When stones sink, they are lifted. Nothing in Venice is permanent, yet everything persists. That is its paradox and its poetry. A civilization that floats, not because it defies nature, but because it listens to it. Today, as scientists install sensors beneath the piazza and divers monitor the piles with underwater drones, the same question remains. How long can this continue? Venice has survived 1,000 floods, 1,000 warnings, and yet it endures. Not through strength, but through surrender. The crazy engineering of Venice is not its machinery or its walls, but its mindset, the quiet belief that imperfection. As the centuries unfolded and the Renaissance began to cast its golden light upon Europe, Venice stood already matured, a city neither of earth nor of sea, but a place hovering between them. Its streets, which were not streets but rippling canals, had become arteries of commerce and culture. The palaces reflected in the water like painted ghosts, and beneath those shimmering facades lay a secret of engineering that few, even among Venetians, fully grasped. It was a city that required constant maintenance, not in the way of ordinary towns, but as a living organism that could collapse under its own beauty if left unattended. By the 15th century, the Republic had already begun to understand that Venice's survival depended not on walls or armies, but on knowledge. They recorded tides, mapped currents, and developed a primitive form of environmental data collection centuries before the term existed. The water, after all, was both friend and enemy. It carried trade ships full of spices and gold, but it also gnawed constantly at the city's submerged bones. The engineers, craftsmen, and anonymous laborers became silent guardians of a miracle that had no precedent. It was during this era that the construction of the great arsenal reached its peak, a colossal shipyard that was, in essence, the world's first industrial complex. There, assembly lines were born, not in factories of smoke and iron, but along wooden docks, where ships were built piece by piece with clockwork precision. The efficiency of the Venetian arsenal stunned foreign visitors. Entire fleets could be assembled in days. Yet this industrial marvel rested on the same fragile foundation of wood, mud, and patience that supported the rest of the city. Beneath the surface, the submerged forest of larch and oak that held up the buildings remained largely unseen. These timbers, driven deep into the anaerobic lagoon mud, resisted decay because oxygen could not reach them. Each was a silent pillar of faith in human ingenuity. Centuries later, divers and engineers would still marvel at their endurance, still finding the wood firm as stone. The Venetians, without modern chemistry, had somehow achieved what nature itself seemed to forbid, a permanence within impermanence. But the water continued to rise, not dramatically, but with the subtle persistence of time itself. The city's architects adapted with an elegance born of necessity. Entrances were raised, floors reinforced, and facades designed to withstand the gentle, corrosive kisses of salt water. Churches were built with marble, not only for beauty, but for resistance. The Doge's palace, with its airy arches and pale pink stone, was an architectural paradox, solid yet delicate, defensive yet inviting, a symbol of power that appeared almost weightless. During the 16th century, Venice's identity as an engineering masterpiece intertwined with its role as the crossroads of the world. Maps, globes, and treatises on hydraulics were published under the Lion of St. Mark. Venetian cartographers learned to read the tides as others read the stars. Water clocks, pumps, and valves became subjects of both art and science. Even painters like Leonardo da Vinci, who visited Venice briefly, sketched designs for machines to protect the lagoon from floods. Though his schemes were never built, they foretold the endless struggle between invention and nature that would define Venice's destiny.
By the dawn of the 20th century, Venice had already survived everything the world could throw at it: wars, plagues, fires, invasions, and the slow rot of the sea. Yet what it could not prepare for was the quiet, invisible threat of modernity. The city, once protected by isolation, now found itself surrounded by progress, and progress, in its restless arrogance, does not respect patience. The lagoon that had been Venice's mother became its battlefield once again, not against barbarians or empires, but against machines and the changing earth itself. It began slowly, like a rumor whispered through water. The industrial age reached the Venetian mainland, bringing with it the hunger for fuel, electricity, and expansion. Wells were drilled deep beneath the lagoon to draw groundwater for factories on the nearby mainland of Mestre and Marghera. Each gallon taken was a small theft from the city's foundation. The mud compressed, the wooden piles sank deeper, and the earth beneath the city's feet quietly deflated. Within a few decades, Venice had sunk nearly a foot, not from natural causes, but from its own thirst. The engineers who measured the change were not alarmists, they were realists. They understood what the Venetians had always known, that the city was not solid, only stable in motion. But motion has limits. As the subsidence continued, St. Mark's Square, the city's lowest point, began to flood more frequently. What had once been a rare event became annual, then seasonal, then almost routine. The tides no longer asked permission. They simply entered. To those who lived there, it became a rhythm of life. At dawn, the bells rang, and with them came the water. Shopkeepers raised their merchandise on wooden platforms. Children splashed through narrow alleys with laughter that belied the danger. Tourists watched in wonder, photographing what the Venetians endured. Acqua alta, high water, became a spectacle for some, and a slow grief for others. The sound of footsteps on wooden walkways, the reflection of flooded lamps in the piazza, all became part of the city's music, a song written by erosion and endurance. But Venice was never a city to surrender without style. Its engineers, inheritors of 1,000-year struggle, began to document, measure, and understand the sinking world beneath them. In the 1960s, with the creation of the Consorzio Venezia Nuova, a dedicated organization was formed to study and protect the lagoon. Scientists placed instruments in canals, measuring salinity, current speed, sediment levels, and tide patterns. They mapped the lagoon floor in intricate detail, revealing a world of forgotten channels and ancient barriers. For the first time, Venice's body was seen from within. What they found was both reassuring and terrifying. The ancient piles still held firm. The wood, dark and hard, had not decayed. But the sediment beneath them had compacted, like a lung losing air. The lagoon, once shielded from the sea by natural sandbars, had been deepened by modern shipping routes.
Massive cruise ships, tankers, and cargo vessels carved new paths through the fragile ecosystem, accelerating erosion. The lagoon, once a protector, had become a highway, and the city it embraced began to drift closer to the sea each year. There were proposals, some bold, some absurd. One suggested encasing the entire city in a massive glass dome. Another proposed pumping air beneath the foundations to lift the city by pressure alone. Others spoke of floating Venice on giant pontoons, severing it from the earth entirely. But the true Venetians, engineers, architects, and historians, understood that the answer could not be technological alone. It had to be spiritual, respectful of the ancient dialogue between stone and tide. And so, the idea of the MOSI project was born. MOSE, the Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico, was not the invention of a single mind, but a collective act of faith. Its concept was simple in theory. When tides rose too high, massive steel barriers at the lagoon's 3 inlets would lift from the seafloor and block the incoming water. For the first time in 1,000 years, Venice would have a way to say no to the sea. But like all great ambitions, it came with cost, controversy, and irony. The project took decades, billions of euros, and untold patience. It was both a monument to human ingenuity and to human indecision, delayed by politics, corruption, and doubt.
As the years passed, Venice continued to flood. The people adjusted, as they always had. New technologies emerged, sensors that predicted tides hours in advance, computer models that mapped every square meter of the lagoon. But for every solution, a new complication arose. The sea level continued to rise, inch by inch, driven by global warming and melting polar ice. Venice was no longer just a local problem, it was the world's mirror. Its sinking was the planet's metaphor, the visible symptom of an invisible fever. And so, modern engineers became historians by necessity. They studied ancient maps, comparing them to satellite data. They examined Roman writings that described the early lagoon, seeking evidence of natural cycles. They learned that the lagoon had always changed, islands forming and dissolving like thoughts. But the pace had never been so fast, nor the forces so vast. The engineers, once builders, became caretakers of time. Their task was no longer to create, but to preserve, to hold still what nature insisted on moving. Meanwhile, within the city itself, artisans and restorers carried on their quiet wars against decay. Masons repaired marble facades grain by grain. Divers patched submerged walls with lime mortar, working by touch alone in the green dark water. Conservationists developed new materials, breathable plasters that resisted salt, paints that allowed moisture to escape. It was engineering at its most intimate, not grand projects, but small acts of devotion. A city saved not by miracles, but by maintenance. In winter, when fog descends and the canal seems to vanish, Venice becomes a dream suspended in air. The sound of water lapping against stone is the same sound heard 1,000 years ago. It is the sound of continuity. The tourists go, the masks are put away, and the real Venice, the one that engineers and artisans protect, breathes quietly. Beneath it all, the piles still stand. They do not know the world has changed. They do not know about satellites or climate models. They simply hold. The irony of Venice's survival is that its future now depends on the same humility that created it. The Venetians of old did not seek to master nature. They adapted to it. Their modern descendants must learn that lesson again. The Meuse barriers may rise, but they cannot hold forever. The sea does not negotiate in centuries. It negotiates in eras.
Perhaps one day Venice will indeed sink. But even if it does, it will have proven something rare, that beauty and fragility can coexist longer than logic allows. And so the engineers, scientists, and dreamers continue their vigil. Each new flood is measured, analyzed, recorded, a heartbeat on a graph that stretches into the unknown. Venice may one day disappear beneath the waves, but the story of its engineering will not. It will remain a chapter in the long history of human persistence, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful structures are not made of stone or steel, but of faith in the possible. At night, when the tide rises and the city's lights shimmer in the reflected water, Venice becomes both real and unreal, solid and liquid, a memory floating on the surface of time. The people who live there do not see tragedy, they see continuity. Every footstep on a damp bridge, every echo of a bell through fog is proof that the impossible still holds. Venice, the city built on mud and miracles, endures not because it defeats the sea, but because it accepts its embrace. Its engineering is not a battle plan, but a prayer, whispered endlessly between stone and tide, between the living and the drowned, between what is built and what must one day return to the water. The story of Venice in the modern age is not a tale of progress, but of persistence. While the world built skyscrapers and subways, Venice continued to float upon its wooden bones, quietly battling the same tides that had shaped its destiny 1,000 years earlier. Yet by the mid-20th century, the balance between sea and city began to tilt. The waters rose a little higher each year. The floods came more often, and the stones of the piazzas darkened under the lapping brine. In 1966, the city awoke to its greatest catastrophe in centuries. A massive storm swept through the Adriatic, and the lagoons swelled beyond memory. The water rose more than 6 feet above normal, submerging the Piazza San Marco, silencing bells, flooding libraries, and drowning thousands of precious manuscripts. For the first time, the world understood that Venice might truly vanish. Photographs of gondolas drifting through submerged doorways appeared on front pages across continents. The romantic dream of the city turned suddenly tragic. After the floodwaters receded, engineers and scientists from across the world gathered to study the problem. They spoke in technical terms, subsidence, tidal regression, barometric pressure. But beneath the data lay a deeper truth. Venice was sinking, and the sea was rising. Human activity on the mainland, especially the extraction of groundwater for industry, had caused the land beneath the lagoon to subside by inches. Nature and civilization were conspiring, without malice, but with inevitability, to erase a masterpiece. The Italian government, under pressure from the world, launched a series of studies. They measured every tide, every current, every grain of silt. They mapped the lagoon floor with precision unknown before, uncovering ancient channels carved by forgotten rivers. Engineers proposed barriers, gates, dams, and movable walls. Architects dreamed of floating platforms and artificial reefs. But Venice, as always, resisted simple solutions. For decades, the debate over how to save the city became as intricate as its own canals. Environmentalists warned that closing off the lagoon would destroy its delicate ecosystem. Politicians feared costs and corruption. Local Venetians, weary of promises, continued to live with boots by their doors, raising furniture when the Acqua Alta came. The sea became not an enemy, but an expected guest, unwanted yet familiar.
The engineering was extraordinary. Each gate was the size of a small ship, hinged to concrete foundations sunk deep into the sand. Hydraulic systems, sensors, and control centers would manage their rise and fall. In theory, Venice could be sealed off from the sea in under an hour, turning the lagoon into a vast temporary lake. But in practice, the project would take decades, billions of euros, and endless arguments. Work on Moses officially began in 2003. For 20 years before that, it had been debated, redesigned, and delayed. Every step forward seemed to sink under bureaucracy and scandal. Critics called it a monument to human arrogance. Supporters called it the last hope of a dying city. Meanwhile, the floods continued. Tourists walked on raised platforms across St. Mark's Square while waves lapped against the marble lions. Shops closed for days, homes filled with salt water that crystallized on their walls like frost. Yet slowly, the barriers took shape. In enormous dry docks, steel gates were forged and tested. Divers worked in freezing waters to install the hinges. Engineers monitored currents, adjusting each component to account for tides that no machine could fully predict. And through it all, Venice waited, half skeptical, half desperate. Then, in October 2020, after nearly half a century of planning and building, the gates of Moses rose for the first time to meet a major tide. The storm came roaring across the Adriatic, but the city remained dry. The bells of San Marco rang not in alarm, but in triumph. For a moment, it seemed that human ingenuity had again matched nature's force. The engineers wept, the politicians smiled, the citizens dared to hope. But even this triumph was tempered by reality. The system required constant maintenance. It could not be raised too often, or the lagoon's exchange of fresh and salt water would suffer. Sediment would accumulate. Algae would bloom. The machinery itself, exposed to corrosive salt, needed continual care. The victory was fragile, an echo of the same fragility that had always defined Venice. Meanwhile, another threat crept closer: climate change. The global sea continued to rise, faster than the engineers had predicted. Some scientists warned that by the end of the century, even Mose might be overwhelmed. Yet others saw in the project not futility, but faith, a continuation of the thousand-year conversation between Venice and the sea. The city had always survived not by denying its vulnerability, but by embracing it, adapting to each new challenge with quiet persistence. Beyond the technical marvels, there is something deeply human in Venice's struggle. The city is, in essence, a metaphor for civilization itself, built upon unstable foundations, endlessly repaired, endlessly loved. Every era believes it can save Venice. Every era merely prolongs its miracle. The people who live there continue their routines, sweeping their steps, polishing their boats, hanging laundry that sways above the canals. The tourists come and go, leaving ripples that fade like memories. The engineers record data, publish reports, adjust valves. Life continues in slow rhythm, as if time itself moves differently in this city of water. At night, when the lights shimmer on the canal and the sound of waves echoes through stone corridors, one can almost hear the centuries whispering, the voices of builders long gone, reminding the living that no city, no matter how beautiful, can defy nature forever. And yet Venice tries. That, perhaps, is its greatest engineering feat of all. The modern machines that rise from the sea at Lido are merely the newest incarnation of an ancient dream, to coexist with the impossible. They are not walls of defiance, but gestures of reverence. In lifting them, humanity repeats an old ritual, acknowledging both its mastery and its limits. Venice will never be safe. It was never meant to be. It exists precisely in the space between danger and grace. And so, even now, as tides grow stronger and the world watches with anxious admiration, the city remains as it has always been,
a floating testament to the belief that beauty and fragility can endure together. The engineers may change, the machines may rust, the barriers may rise and fall, but the spirit of Venice will drift on, shimmering like the reflections of its own lights upon the ever-moving water. In the long quiet of the lagoon, where the horizon blurs and the sound of the tide folds back upon itself, Venice continues to exist in defiance of time. The engineers who walk its narrow paths today, their boots damp with salt, carry notebooks and sensors instead of hammers and chisels. They are heirs to a lineage of forgotten artisans who once measured the flow of tides with ropes and sticks, who once listened to the whispers of wood beneath the foundations and knew, without calculation, when the city sighed. Now machines record what hands once felt, and data replaces intuition. But the essence remains the same, the understanding that Venice is a living experiment that cannot be finished. Every generation inherits both a problem and a promise. The problem is the sea, eternal and patient. The promise is that the city will still be here tomorrow. Between these two truths lies the daily rhythm of maintenance that defines Venetian life. The workers who repair stone steps each dawn, the engineers who monitor the movement of tides, the historians who translate old maps, all are part of a choreography that began more than 1,000 years ago. To maintain Venice is not to fix it, but to accompany it, to move with it as one moves with a slow and unpredictable friend. There are days when the water glows like glass, when the reflections of palaces seem more solid than the buildings themselves. On those mornings, Venice appears eternal, as if the world has paused to admire its own reflection. But there are also days of wind and heavy rain, when the lagoon rises like a breathing creature, pressing against the steps of churches and doorways. The water creeps silently inside the rooms, spreading beneath chairs, lifting carpets, leaving behind a thin white trace of salt when it withdraws. The Venetians no longer panic. They adjust. They lift, clean, dry, and continue. This cycle of intrusion and recovery has become the pulse of the city, a rhythm older than any clock. The modern era brought satellites, sensors, and real-time tide monitoring systems. Engineers built computer models capable of predicting floods days in advance. Yet the most remarkable truth remains unchanged. All these devices serve the same ancient purpose: to listen to water. The Venetians, more than any other people, have learned to live not beside water, but with it. Their buildings breathe moisture. Their stones exhale salt. Their walls absorb history. Each restoration, each repainting, each reinforcement adds another layer to the city's skin, until the architecture itself becomes a palimpsest of survival.